Welcome to Moore Up North. I'm Shannyn Moore, and I'm so glad you're joining us this week. You know, it's been quite an election week, and I guess every headline could have just said going to extremes if you looked at what was coming back from the ballots. But we're actually talking about Going to Extremes, the book by Joe McGinniss that he wrote over 30 years ago, and it's just come back out, and I think you're going to love it. We'll be right back. I don't think they're clapping for me, though, sadly. Welcome back to Moore Up North. I'm so glad you're joining us this week. This show I've been really looking forward to doing. Joe McGinniss is here. You might have heard of him. He is a journalist, a New York Times best-selling author. He wrote a great Alaskan classic called Going to Extremes 30-some years ago. And this book has just been re-released in its 30th anniversary. It's now available at bookstores all over Anchorage. And Joe, of course, is back in Alaska writing another book, but I want to talk about this one specifically, Going to Extremes with him. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you, Shannyn.
Joe the neighbor.
Joe the neighbor. Joe the good neighbor.
You are, and Joe the amazing author. I don't know that, I know I grew up with the book Going to Extremes in my house. Many Alaskans have read it. Many, if you haven't read it, you should, because you might actually get a real flavor for the state that you live in. When did you start writing? Did you do something else first?
Before writing at all? No, because nobody would pay me to do anything else. That was, I graduated from college and the only job I could get was on a newspaper. And so, other than teaching for a few years here and there, writing's been the only thing I've still ever been able to get paid for. You know, I mean, some people are good at fixing snow machines, right? Some people are good at running boats. I can't do any of that kind of thing. The only thing I've ever been able to do with any sort of skill has been to write. And besides which, it's fun, because the writing isn't fun. The writing is the hard part, but the research is almost always just wonderful. And when the research involves being in Alaska, it's 10 times more wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know you were required reading in some college classes, certainly for me with the Selling of the President.
The classes that I taught, I was required reading in. Yeah, I made sure of that.
So I want to know about Going to Extremes. At what point, what was going on in your life when it was, hey, you can write a book about Alaska, they're putting in a pipeline and the place has gone crazy, it might be interesting. Like, how did all of that, who said go write this book?
Well, I did, but that's actually an interesting question, because for the 3 to 4 years before that, I had written a book called Heroes, which was supposed to be, well, it was, in a sense, a book about my search for the vanished American hero. But for one reason or another, it became a book mostly about the inside of my own head. And I got very tired of myself, and I thought I'd like to go someplace where myself doesn't, I don't have to think about myself, because I'll be flooded by so much new, fresh experience that I'll just be living a life completely outside my own head. And at that time, there was actually a fellow CBS producer from 60 Minutes who had become friends with my wife and I, and he was visiting us, telling us that back in the 1960s, he'd had a job as a weatherman on one of the Anchorage TV stations. I'm not sure how many there were then, but he did the weather, and he said it was a pretty simple job because, 9 months a year, you said cold and dark, and that's the weather. And either snow or no snow, but there weren't a lot of subtleties. But he began talking about some of his experiences out here, and it got me curious. And then we got a National Geographic in the mail, that I forget what the story was, but attached to it was this fold-out, wall-sized map of Alaska. And I unfolded it. I said, my God, it's just nothing but empty space. You know, wow, look at this. There's like 3 roads in a state that's 2.5 times as big as Texas. This is amazing. I wonder what it's like out there. I wonder what it would be like to be there. And that's usually what gets me started, is just this curiosity. And I said, well, the only way to find out is to go there. It happened to be 1975 when the pipeline was under construction. And I read enough in advance to know that Alaska was in the process of changing from what it had been into what it would become. But it wasn't going to be the same after the pipeline was finished and the oil began to go through. So I had this concept about, you know, Alaska is America's last frontier. Are these the last days of the last frontier? Will this oil business change Alaska so much that it'll become like every place else? I don't know, but let's go out and find out. And it was tough to persuade a publisher that this was a good idea, because publishers said, who would ever want to read a book about Alaska? Nobody cares about it, nobody's heard of it, you know, it's never in the news. And it was difficult, but I finally persuaded a publisher to give me a contract that would allow me to come out here and to live here for a year, to wander around, see as much as I could see. And my wife, she wasn't then my wife, Nancy Doherty, came with me. And the way it was then, and I guess in some ways it still is, if you walk into a newspaper and you say, hi, I'd like to be a reporter. They say, well, can you type? And she said, yeah, sure. Have you ever written anything? Yeah, I've written a couple of things. You're hired, you know? I mean, Alaska was a land of opportunity in terms of employment. So Kay Fanning hired Nancy to work at the Anchorage Daily News, and she did that for the year that I was wandering all up and down the state, east and west, north and south. And then I went back home to write the book, and I realized after 6 months of writing that there were still things I needed that I hadn't gotten. I knew I had to go back. So I came back in the late spring of '77 and stayed through the fall of '77. That was the summer when there were all the hearings on HR 39 and expanding the national parks. And Mo Udall was out here, and John Sieberling, the congressman who was the head of that subcommittee. And everybody was testifying. You know, Joe Vogler was saying that, you know, one more land of federal government is going to have to be built over his dead body. And then a couple of years later, he was killed. But it was it was a fascinating time because so much was happening. I was in Valdez the day the first oil got there. Thanks to my friend Tom Brennan, who worked for Atlantic Richfield then, I got up on the North Slope in a way that very few other writers did. We got to see a lot of that going on. And mostly I acted on whim. I said, I bet Nome would be a great place to spend New Year's Eve. So Nancy and I flew to Nome for New Year's Eve. And I was right. It was a great place to spend New Year's Eve. I wouldn't want to spend another, but one was just about right.
So, that's so great. So how is Nome on New Year's Eve? What were you, it was changing to 76? No, 77?
It was changing from 75 to 76. And
wow.
Excuse me. Nome was resounding to the sound of gunfire, and it wasn't people just shooting pistols up into the air. There were a few disputes that got settled out in the street with firearms. Nobody that I know of got killed that night, but I met more people with more stories from different parts of the world and different parts of the food chain, really, on that one night in Nome than I could have found in a year anywhere else. And I have fond memories of Nome, although some of the people in Nome, when they read the book, were not pleased by the portrayal. You know, people, actually, a lot of people in Alaska were very angry about this book when it came out because I think it was the first book that ever tried to show what you would experience if you actually lived in Alaska among Alaskans and weren't just seeing a certain subset of people to talk about a specific subject. I didn't hang out with politicians. I didn't hang out with the elite of Alaska. I just hung out with whoever I happened to meet next. And it was, as a result, it wasn't like a travelogue. It wasn't a thing that said, oh, the whales and the mountains and the midnight, sun, and that became the big part of it. I wrote the book where I started with winter, which was the darkness and all the crazy people acting crazy, and then it wound up with the summer section. And the last chapter was about a 13-day hike I took in the Brooks Range, which is still the most magical 2 weeks of my life. It meant so much. The child that we had after we got back from Alaska, we gave him the middle name of Brooks because the Brooks Range just was such a special place, and I wanted somebody in my family to carry that name. So in the end, I think it's a love letter to Alaska, but it didn't disguise any of the warts. And some people were sensitive about an outsider coming in and writing about their place. Say, well, what does he know? I didn't know anything. That's the point. I went here to find out. I never pretended to know anything. And I'm not saying that my description of Homer or Nome or Bethel or Barrow, that that's the way the town is. That's the experience that I had being in that town.
So how you met people, you were saying it was on a whim. Did you find people were willing to say, they'd sit down and have coffee with you, talk to you, and then say, you've got to talk to so-and-so. And did you have sort of this chain of meetings that way?
An unbroken chain, really. I came up on the ferry from Seattle in November, and I met a guy on the ferry. My plan was I was going to take the ferry to Juneau and then fly from Juneau to Anchorage, but I met this guy on the ferry who had just bought a truck in Seattle, and he's bringing it back, and he said, no, stay on till Haines, and I'll drive you to Anchorage. So I did that with him, and then when we got here, he introduced me to, I knew Tom Brennan and Marnie Brennan. Those are the only people I knew in Alaska, and for the first few weeks, they were kind enough to let me stay at their house while I tried to figure out where to live and how to live. But it was really an unbroken chain, because one person leads you to the next, and then Alaskans, and this is still, I found this summer too. This is so true still today. Alaskans are the biggest-hearted, most open, welcoming people on Earth. It's remarkable. There's everybody tries to be helpful, as long as you don't get in their face.
Right. Absolutely. We've got to run to a. We've got to run to a break, and we'll follow up with that a little bit. Yeah, I think Alaskans are a bunch of people that want to be around a bunch of people that don't want to be around anyone. That's my take on us, and I don't mind it so much. We'll be right back with Moore Up North and Joe McGinniss.
Question next?